who served in North Farnham Parish in Rappahannock County from 1687 to 1692. And we've identified 6 members of the Huguenot Society of Virginia who descended from Huguenots who settled in the Rappahannock Valley. Dr. Lee's extensive research over 15 years culminated in him publishing his findings in the Huguenot-Anglican Refuge in Virginia. And there are copies that some of you have purchased as well. Dr. Lee is a native of Wichita, Kansas, and a graduate of the University of Kansas Princeton Theological Seminary and Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. For over 4 decades of pastoral ministry, Dr. Lee served 4 Presbyterian churches in Oklahoma, Texas, and Illinois. He is flown in from Kansas, and we hope you'll enjoy his special presentation. Let me present Dr. Lee. Thank you.
It is so good to be with you today, and I am privileged to be part of your gathering. And I have to say, I especially appreciated your opening exercises with prayers and French. It felt really good and so appropriate. Let me just say right off, I learned when I was a school child to say Huguenot, and since I have had the privilege of studying and doing research in England, I have gone over to the English pronunciation of Huguenot, which is Huguenot. And the French actually would say Huguenot. The French wouldn't pronounce the H or the T, but the English has sort of done a hybrid of those two, so they pronounce the H but not the T. So I got in the habit of saying Huguenot, and so just to let you know that's why I'm saying that. But I know what you're talking about when you say Huguenot. I get it. That's fine. All right. Let's see. We're working on the lights here so we can see.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm ready to go to the slides whenever we can get the lights ready, Joel. Okay. Very good. Well, I'm always grateful for a chance to talk about my book, A Huguenot-Anglican Refuge in Virginia, Empire, Land, and Religion in the Rappahannock region. This project began with genealogical curiosity about an ancestor named John Bertrand. He was a Huguenot minister. He was born in France. He was ordained to the ministry in France. He immigrated to England, where he lived for the better part of a decade. And then he went to Virginia in 1687. And I looked for the historical context of his immigration to America, and I could not find any. And so I wondered, did he come to America by himself? Why Virginia? And why was this Huguenot minister serving Anglican parishes? What you see on the screen is a pipe stem that was found at the home of John Bertrand at his plantation, at the plantation house, and it has JB engraved on it. So a good reason to believe this goes directly back to this 17th century ancestor. It's quite a find. So in trying to find the historical context for this ancestor, I read all the literature on the Huguenot migration to North America. and I could find no organized migration to Virginia until 1700, 13 years after my ancestor arrived. And that was to another part of the colony, to Mannequin, near here. What I'm showing you on the screen is a book by John Butler, which has been considered the definitive study of Huguenots in America, and it was done by Butler, who is a Harvard historian, and he published it in 1983. And basically, Butler said, you know, there aren't nearly as many Huguenots as people have always thought. It's a smaller group. But interestingly enough, he didn't even look at Virginia. And he didn't consider Mannequin even worth study, because he thought the Mannequin folks were second and third generation. They weren't the people who were forced out of France. But he was wrong about that too. There has been a great deal of historical research and writing about the Huguenot diaspora as a whole. Here you see a chart showing the escape routes of Huguenots who fled France after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, 1685. And from this chart, you can see Huguenots who were in Western France, by and large, fled by sea. And some went to England, some went on to the Netherlands, some went on to Scandinavia. Huguenots who were in Eastern France fled by land, Switzerland, Germany, and the Netherlands. Some fled into Italy, where they were able to go by sea around up into Northern Europe. So this part of the Huguenot story is well documented by researchers. But as I researched John Bertrand in Virginia County records, I was struck by the large number of French surnames in the counties of Richmond, Essex, and Lancaster along the Rappahannock River. So this is an early Virginia map that is showing the Rappahannock River. And you got Lancaster here, Middlesex County here, Essex County here, and Richmond County here, and Westmoreland coming up this way. And I thought, you know, this is interesting that there's so many French surnames, and I began to wonder why. When I began to cross-reference some of these names in Huguenot archives in England and France, I began finding matches, including a significant number of the Rappahannock Huguenots being from John Bertrand's home church in the town of Cozes in western France. This is a picture that's one of my most prized research finds. This is the baptism register for the Protestant Church of Cozes, France. And there's just a fragment of it that survived. And the fragment, 1656 to 1668, by the grace of God, that fragment has the names of people being baptized who by 1685, they were young adults, they were the right age to flee France, and some of them to come to Virginia. So I was finding Virginia people in this baptism register, and and many of them were baptized by John Bertrand's father, who was the pastor of this Protestant church of Cozes. When I was able to go to Cozes and work in the town archives, I was able to identify the Catholic baptisms for the same period. And what I discovered was 80% of the baptisms in this town during this time period were Protestant. This is a very Protestant town in a country where Protestants were being persecuted. So, the next important find that I had was discovering that The governor of Virginia, Francis Howard, pictured here, Baron of Effingham, had made an offer to attract Huguenots to Virginia that was published in Europe in 1687. And this is the pamphlet. The pamphlet was published at the Hague in French to convince French exiles in Europe to go to Virginia, to say, Virginia is much better than South Carolina. It's much better than New England. Virginia is the place for you. And what I've taken a picture of here is an English translation that was done in the 1930s and then published here in the United States. But this French publication is pretty significant because Governor Howard invites the Huguenots who want to come to Virginia to bring one or two bilingual French ministers with them, and he promised that he would pay them a salary out of the colony's funds to preach in French to the Huguenot refugees if they would also preach in English to settlers in the established Anglican parishes of the colony. So the governor is trying to kill two birds with one stone here. They've got a shortage of ministers. So here's a way to recruit ministers for an established Anglican parish, but also a way to encourage Frenchmen to come who don't want to come unless they can hear the gospel preached in French. Then I was able to connect John Bertrand and 4 other French exile ministers who followed him to the Rappahannock region, specifically to the governor's dual tract ministry proposal, preaching in English to the English settlers, preaching in French to the newly arriving French refugees. So James Boisseau came soon after Bertrand. There's not much of a record trail on him. I don't know much about him. Nicholas Moreau, I know him, but he didn't stay that long. Louis Latenay arrived on the Nassau, one of the ships that brought the Mannequin settlers, but he didn't go to Mannequin. He already had a job along the Rappahannock River. And he arrived the same year that John Bertrand died, and started ministry in Essex County, also right on the Rappahannock River. And then later, James Maury, and Maury's interesting. He technically is not a Huguenot because he grew up in France after the French Protestant church had been outlawed. He grew up a Roman Catholic. He was trained to be a Roman Catholic priest. He was a Roman Catholic priest. Then he went to England and became an Anglican, and they were looking for someone who could go to Virginia, to the Rappahannock, who could preach in French and English, and they sent Maury. And so he was preaching in French to the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the original refugees who came with John Bertrand. So you have an 80-year time period where you have dual-track ministry of preaching in English and preaching in French. So, 5 months after Governor Howard's offer was published in French in Europe, John Bertrand arrived in old Rappahannock County, which is present-day Richmond County, to serve the North Farnham Church, pictured here. And it's clear from the records that Bertrand brought dozens of exiles with him, and many of them were from his hometown in Cozes, France, people who had been baptized as infants by his father in Cozes. This was the beginning of the Huguenot-Anglican Refuge in Virginia. We don't know precisely how Bertrand's ministry at North Farnham worked. It seems likely that he held one service each Sunday in English and one service in French. It's also likely that Huguenot exiles were traveling some distance up and down the Rappahannock River to attend French language services. So this is another map that shows where the church was located. North Farnham Church is right here now, but at the time in 1687 it was up here closer to the river. And I'm sure you all know your Virginia history, and you know there were no towns in Virginia during this period. And so people were living on plantations, and the rivers were the transportation system. There weren't very many roads either. And so what you have happening is people scattered up and down the river. This is one of the reasons the historians didn't find this particular Huguenot migration to America. There was no town. Most of the studies have to do with a Huguenot town someplace or a Huguenot church someplace. Here, there was not a town, there was not a church. They were scattered up and down the river, and they were getting their French preaching from Anglican-ordained ministers who were bilingual, who were Frenchmen who could also preach in English. By 1690, Bertrand was also serving Whitechapel Parish in Lancaster County, and this is the St. Mary's Whitechapel Church as it exists today. And a few years after that, Bertrand purchased the Belle Isle Plantation on the Rappahannock River, most of which is now a state park by that name. It's kind of an amazing, again, by the grace of God, I think. Bertrand had a plantation of 924 acres, and it hasn't been made into a housing development. The state bought it, and almost all, 95% of that 924 acres is now preserved as a state park. And the house built by Bertrand's great-grandson is still there, and that house is being renovated. It's not ready to be toured today, but the state, there's a foundation that's raising funds to renovate that house so that it can be a place that visitors can tour. So my very long-term research project ultimately provided a detailed picture of a large Huguenot migration to Virginia that, as I said, has been hidden to historians for almost 300 years. This map shows where more than 300 families settled along the Rappahannock River between 1687 and 1710. So here you're seeing the Rappahannock River, and then starting basically where the town of Urbana is, and then coming up the river to Rappahannock, up here, and then on up to Fredericksburg at the far edge. And this incorporated parts of 8 counties. And all of these counties at this time had a location along the river. You know, some of these counties have been changed now to be oriented toward roads, but they were all oriented toward the river. Stafford County is right on the Rappahannock River. So there was a Huguenot community at Brentown up here in Stafford, but they could get to the Rappahannock very quickly and get down to hear the preaching down in that area. James Boisseau was over in this area, and we know that there was a fair number of Huguenots here along the Mattapony River. But again, they had good access to the Rappahannock from there. And as I say, there's a story about Boisseau, but I don't know it because all those records have been destroyed. And, so that's a piece of it that's still missing. But I drew these lines on the map to give an idea of where this community was. It was large, but it was scattered, but with the river providing a communication system and a transportation system where they could readily come together for worship and to support one another in other ways. So my book tries to tell the full story, to the extent that we know it, of the 1687 migration with the purpose of bringing an unknown piece of Huguenot and Virginia history to light. This gravestone is the only gravestone of a 1687 refugee that I've been able to find in Virginia. And you can see it today at Vaughters Episcopal Church in Loretto, Virginia. It's a gravestone of Paul McCoe. And the McCoe family had a close relationship with the Bertrand family in Cozes. And he was baptized by John Bertrand's father. And John Bertrand's mother was a godmother of one of his sisters. McCoe was a doctor, and there's a lot of information about him in the records, because he's always trying to collect money from the widows and orphans of his patients who died. And of course, that's how they did business in those days, was to go to court. They had to collect something. They didn't send a bill in the mail. They went to court to do it. So, but he also was a merchant. And along the Rappahannock, this was a key place for merchants who were doing transatlantic trade. And the people from Cozes were already merchant-oriented before they left Cozes. So McCoe was a successful physician, a successful merchant, and then he married into, I think his second marriage was to an English woman and a wealthy settler family. And he became, I think, the wealthiest of the Rappahannock Huguenots. The book covers approximately a century of history, from Louis XIV's persecution of Protestants in France during the 1660s to the religious and cultural transformation of Virginia in the 1760s, with particular emphasis, as I said, on the years of the French migration to the Rappahannock area of Virginia from 1687 to 1710. Here you see Le Grand Louis in all of his regalia. There are copies of a timeline of the history covered by the book available today. On the table on the back has a timeline for those of you who like to dig into the history. I prepared a timeline of the history as it's covered in the book. So feel free to take one of those if you're interested in that. And back to Paul McCoe again, and this is Paul McCoe's baptism record, the same Paul McCoe that I found the gravestone for, and his baptism in the Cozes Protestant Register. The book documents more than 300 Huguenot households and indentured servants along the Rappahannock between 1677 and 1710, making it, I think, a unique resource for genealogy. So I've listed all of those 300 and some in one of the appendix of the book, and then provided some basic information about each of those and some documentation about each of them. So I think there's an opportunity for people who may not know they're descendant of Huguenots to maybe find an ancestor in this record that then can let them know that all of a sudden they're eligible to become a member of this group. So something you can make use of in your recruitment efforts. I tried to write the book for a general audience, avoiding the technical language commonly used by historians and theologians. The book identifies two approaches to Huguenot migration to America, and these two approaches are defined by the two largest French exile congregations in London. One approach was the one used by the Threadneedle Street Huguenot Church, which became a 9,000 member church at one point. And the idea there was to protect an autonomous Huguenot identity, to do church, to form a community that's just like what we had in France. And the churches that were established in Boston, the churches that were established in New York City, the initial churches in South Carolina, they followed this pattern of churchmanship. And they looked to the Threadneedle Street Church for ministers. That, please send us ministers. And historians understand that, but what historians have not understood as well is that there was another strategy for settling Huguenots in America, and this is a strategy that was established by the Savoy Church in London, not as large as Threadneedle Street, but still has 5,000 members. We would still call that a mega church by today's standards, certainly. And their strategy was to pursue rapid assimilation to English culture through participating in the Anglican Church. So the Savoy Church became an Anglican church in London, but they worshiped in French, and they preached like they were Presbyterians, but they still used the Book of Common Prayer, but translated into French. And this is a drawing of a planned expansion of the Savoy Church that was done by Christopher Wren in 1685. The refugees were pouring into London at that time, so these churches were having to expand. Now, the advocates of this second approach of the Savoy Church, they were the ones who led the migration to Virginia, because their pastors were getting ordained in England first and becoming Anglicans in England, and then coming on to Virginia. And then as they preached in French in Virginia, they were using this book, this French translation of the Book of Common Prayer. And we know this was in Virginia. We've seen the records of these books being ordered to be sent to Virginia. La liturgie is what they called it. So, the previously unknown Huguenot migration to Virginia that I've been able to document also appears to be the largest in North America, as demonstrated by this chart. For all of these communities, except for the Virginia ones, I used John Butler's numbers from his 1983 book. Mannequin has been pretty well studied, and the number of 300, historians agree on that number is the likely number who were the settlers in Mannequin. But when you're dealing with 256 families and 56 indentured servants, and when you factor it out based on the normal size of households for the 17th century, you come up with over 1,000 who were in the Rappahannock region, which sort of dwarfs all of the other Huguenot communities. But as I said earlier, in the Rappahannock, they were more scattered. It wasn't like they were in one town or all together in one congregation. They were up and down. Rappahannock River, but a significant piece, nonetheless, for the study of Huguenots in America. In Mannequin, by the way, there were a lot more than 300 who came on those 5 ships. And I've been able to find around 100 of them that were along the Rappahannock. So some of those folks never even went to Mannequin. They came knowing that they were going to join their friends and their relatives who were already settled along the Rappahannock. Well, historians who've already reviewed my book are suggesting that it will generate a reassessment of the size and scope of the Huguenot migration to America. And one of the historians who's saying that is Owen Stanwood, and I know some of you probably have read his book, The Global Refuge. And this is his drawing of where Huguenots were, where they settled in North America, up and down the eastern seaboard. And his book was published, I think, in 2022, and now he's going to have to redo the chart in order to get the Rappahannock in there. And Owen was kind enough to say some nice things on the cover of my book in a blurb, saying that, you know, maybe there were a lot more Huguenots in America than historians have thought. The book is published by Lexington Books Fortress Academic. It's an imprint of the Roman and Littleton Publishing Group, and it's part of its Anglican Studies series, and it has been peer-reviewed by a historian. Now, one of the dilemmas for me is that because it seemed to me, and Owen Stanwood helped to confirm that for me before the book came out, that this was a book that has the potential to change the way historians are looking at the Huguenot migration to America. I knew I had to get it published by an academic publishing house. And unfortunately, what that means is they cost a lot of money. You can't, they don't publish $20 paperbacks. They sell books for $100 and they market to libraries. So those of you who picked up my book already will notice it's a heavyweight paperback. This is a book that's going to last 100 years or more. That's what they sell to libraries, and that's sort of the marketing approach that academic publishers use. But it was important for me to do it that way so that it gets the eyeballs of historians, because of the nature of what well, it's not because I'm smart, mainly because I'm lucky. I just happen to be looking in the right place and finding something that historians had missed. So I'll be happy to respond to questions, but I brought a few books along, and I don't know if there are any left. They were selling fast. Which is great. Because the book is heavy, I didn't want to carry too many of them on the airplane. It's a heavy load. But if there's a book left, have they all been taken, or is there one that's not spoken for yet? Okay, I guess they've all been taken.
I'm the registrar.
Yes. Well, the books I brought along I could sell for $60 with the help of a generous benefactor. But I also brought discount coupons, and you can use those with the publisher for a 30% discount to purchase a book for $73. Those are on the back table if you want a discount coupon. So I'll be happy to answer questions, and you tell me when my time's up.
Anybody might have, glad to ask Dr. Lee about them.
Do you have ancestors yourself in Essex County or in that area?
Yeah, well, John Bertrand was an ancestor, and he was in Richmond County, and then he moved to Lancaster County.
So do you have any Lee ancestry?
I don't.
Coincidentally.
Yes.
You mentioned the Walter, you didn't pronounce it Walter, Episcopal Church. Were they the Walters?
Yes. OTA.
Wow.
And they're on my list. Yeah, if you look at the list in the back, there were OTAs who came in the late 1680s. So yes, I think they were part of this. And I don't know
Yeah.
the precise history of that church. And I don't know, you know, the specific person that they named it after, or if it was a general family. But I found the early arriving Vautiers who became Vauters, because, and this is of course what happened everywhere with the Huguenots, is they anglicized their names, and in some cases they even translated their names. The Blancs became the Whites and things like that, which makes it hard. You know, the Foxes became the Reynauds, became the Foxes, and so I think there are a lot of Huguenots that you're never going to be able to identify because they translated the names and you can't get behind that.
Any other questions? Good, well, thank you so very much. I wanted to give you a little certificate here of thank you. And also, there's a plaque here that I'll ask you to read.
Nice.
You read it out loud to everyone.
I will do that. The National Huguenot Society recognizes the contribution of Lonnie H. Lee, descendant of John Bertrand, to the history of the Huguenots through his seminal research on the Huguenots who fled France to England and became leaders in colonial Virginia, and his publication of the Huguenot-Anglican Refuge in Virginia, and awards him the Dr. Gresham T. Farr Jr. Scholarly Works Award. Whoa!
So, you're welcome. So it's
Oh, what a great surprise!
yes, and so it's for $1,000, so it's
Yeah.
not just a little bit.
Great.
But we're so thankful that you joined us today, and I'm sure there'll be people who want to talk to you.
Yeah, and I can hang around for a while
Sure,
after the meeting
sure,
if
sure.
anybody wants to
Good,
chat.
good, good. Thank
Glad to
you.
do that. Well, thank you
Good.
so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you.